Our speaker this evening, Jared Del Rosso, received his bachelor's degree from Brandeis University and his master's and PhD degrees from Boston College, all in sociology. He's associate professor of sociology and criminology at University of Denver. His teaching background includes areas of cultural sociology, subjects like social and criminal theory, theories of violence, and the environment. He's written two books. One is entitled Talking About Torture, How Political Discourse Shapes the Debate, and that was published in 2015. And his second one is Denial, How We Hide, Ignore, and Explain Away Problems. That was published in 2022. So you may be wondering how, with this background, why Jared's talking about the WPW, whippoorwill. And so Jared is now working on a book tentatively entitled The Lonesome Whippoorwill, the Untold Story of America's Most Iconic Bird. And that's due to be published sometime in 2025 or 2026 by New York University Press. For many centuries, the whippoorwill figured prominently in the seasonal lives of an essentially agrarian American society. Americans eagerly awaited the whippoorwill's song in early spring, which heralded the end of winter and could possibly fulfill wishes, guarantee wealth, and cure backaches. The whippoorwill's enigmatic nocturnal life has inspired many poets, writers, and musicians like Henry David Thoreau, Stephen King, and Hank Williams. In fact, the working title of Jared's upcoming book, the Lonesome Whippoorwill, The Unlikely Story of America's Most Iconic Bird, comes from the opening line of Hank Williams' song, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, a reference to the whippoorwill. Jared's book is not only about the whippoorwill itself, but it's about us and how we understand changing relationships among birds, the natural world, and our own lives. Jared has led field trips for DFO and the Highline Canal Conservancy, and he's written articles for the Lark Bunting and blogs for the Center for Humans and Nature. He's an avid birder and native wildflower gardener. Jared, we're very pleased to have you as our speaker tonight.
Thank you so much, Bill. And thank you all for being here with me tonight. Thank you to DFO. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you about my work. I'm going to get a PowerPoint up in a moment. But I've been a member with DFO. I'm not even in that 10-year bracket, I don't think. But for a little while now, I've occasionally led trips. I've written for the Lark Bunting. So it's really amazing for me to be able to share this work with you all. This is the first time I've been able to present it kind of at length and also to the bird watching community. And I'm just so grateful it's with Denver field ornithologists. So thank you all for having me. Bear with me 1 minute while I get my PowerPoint loaded and shared with you all. All right. And thank you again. Thank you again for being here with me and having me here to speak about my work. Just one thing briefly, Bill did an amazing job, better job than I think I would have done introducing this book, but I'll just add to that by saying that it's about half drafted. Half drafted is a little bit different than half actually written or half done, certainly different than half done. So what I'm presenting to you all today is kind of part of or a portion of those untold stories that I'm beginning to collect, that I have been collecting. Certainly there's going to be more as I write the book. This presentation may develop and change the more I engage with the research and the more I write. Before I get into the bulk of the talk, I just want to talk to you a little bit about why I'm writing this book, because here is the eastern whippoorwill, just a picture to give us a sense of who this bird is. On the left, you have one of those typical range maps. This one's from All About Birds. And it shows that the range of the eastern whippoorwill is kind of up into just a little bit into central Canada, mostly though southern Canada, the upper Midwest, New England, through the US South. You see it over winters in coastal Carolina, down through the South, down through Mexico and Central America. You all know where Colorado is on this map. And you all can see that the eastern whippoorwill doesn't really enter the state. So this really begs the question of why would a Colorado birder be writing a book about eastern whippoorwills, a bird who's not really present in Colorado? And as Bill kind of alluded to, why would a sociologist whose background is whose previous work has been around violence be writing a book about birds? I'm not a biologist. I'm not an ornithologist. I'll do my best with the natural history to give you all a sense of who this bird is, what this bird is really about. But by way of introducing me, myself, this work, who I am as a birder and a sociologist, I just want to begin by saying, and some of you who know me know this about me, that this family of birds that the eastern whippoorwill is in, the nightjar family, the goatsucker family, is my favorite family of birds. It took me a while as a birder to say I had a favorite bird. Took me about, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years before I can say that. And it's this bird photographed here. This was a common nighthawk perched all day along the Mississippi River, who I encountered when I lived up in St. Paul. I've had the great pleasure of encountering it over and over and over again in Colorado, the Denver metro area. But probably my definitive experience was standing in Cheeseman Park under some street lamps well after the species is usually out, with 3 of them feeding in the park rather low, coming really close, feeling like they were almost at arm's length. I think since then, I've been pursuing this bird all across the species, all across Denver, and now in Centennial, where I live. I also am quite enamored with another bird in this family photographed here. I'm sure you immediately have seen this bird. It's so easy to see in a photograph like this. But in 2015, birding Denver Botanic Gardens, finding that common poorwill, we're using the gardens as a migratory stopover in the spring and autumn, a place that was just a mile from my home. Encountering them all through May was a really special experience for me. And that kind of brought me to this family. I was reading about especially nighthawks, how they use urban and suburban landscapes, since I live and bird in an urban and suburban landscape. I was reading a little bit about poorwills, and I decided as I finished my previous book, I wanted to write a book about birds. And so it was of course, this family. But why the eastern whippoorwill? One answer is that I grew up within the range of the eastern whippoorwill. I didn't know the bird as a child. I had never heard it. I didn't really know it existed. But here you have the data, and the first breeding bird survey in New York actually comes from when I was growing up there. I was a child then. You've got this flashing star in downstate New York, just north of the city. Roughly where I grew up, you can see some potential nesting sites around my home. But this has kind of caused me to think that some of my foundational experiences of the environment, of nature, of other species is in a landscape very much like the landscape that whippoorwills choose. But the fact that I didn't know this bird has led me to some questions about what it means to live near such an iconic and culturally important species without really knowing that it's there. And then probably as a sociologist, the best answer to this question of why would a sociologist write about a bird is that the stories around whippoorwills are so rich, so important, so meaningful. As Bill really put it in a lovely kind of way, this bird can tell us so much about us. And so as I've been researching this bird, I've been collecting these stories, organizing them, clustering them, trying to tell my own kind of new story of what the whippoorwill means and what those meanings reveal about us, about the environment, about nature, about the bird, and perhaps hopefully about the future of kind of living with this species and really all species in a changing climate. So tonight, I'm going to tell you three of those stories. These don't exhaust the stories I'm writing about, but they're the three I want to talk to you about today. I want to introduce you to this amazing family of birds. They're kind of obscure. If you're a birder, you've had some encounters with them, but most of us don't spend a lot of time with the nightjars. If you're a newer birder, you might not have even met your first nightjar, encountered your first nightjar. I'm going to tell you the story of whippoorwills as birds in 5 words that I've encountered that I really quite like. I'm then going to turn to the cultural story. I'm going to tell you about the year's first whippoorwill. And then I'm going to talk to you about species decline. So I'm going to talk to you about the idea of the last whippoorwill, the idea that whippoorwills are declining, what that means for them and what that means for us. So let's meet those nightjars. You can't tell the story of nightjars, also known as goat suckers, without telling the story of the Eurasian species, the European species, the Eurasian nightjar. Largely, you can't tell that story because the mythology of the goat sucker and also the name nightjar comes from this bird. The mythology is kind of well documented. There was a time in Europe where it was believed that this bird was attacking goats at night, was drinking the milk of female goats, domestic goats, and blinding them in the process. Of course, this wasn't true. It was probably because people who kept goats would see the bird around the goats. Goats draw flying insects. There's all kinds of reasons that we might be observing this behavior. But it gave this legend, which goes back at least to Aristotle, who documented it over 2,000 years ago in his writing on animals, persisted, gave the family its scientific name, which means goat milker, and essentially became a global way of knowing this bird. So too did the name nightjar. For a while, I was really uncurious about this name. It seemed odd to me. Why would a bird be like a jar, a physical object? But that's not the meaning of jar here. The meaning of jar here refers to the bird's sound, which is often described as a churring, a kind of mechanical churring, but it's also got some discordant, jarring qualities or qualities that deserve that name jar. So the name nightjar refers here, like the whippoorwill name, refers here to the bird's song. Because most of us, myself included, probably have never heard this bird, I want to play it for you now. You can hear how discordant and how jarring it would be to hear this bird at night when light is dim and you don't know what's making this noise from the darkness. A really quite kind of amazing sound, as many nightjars really have. In the US, we have 8 species of nightjars who breed in the US. We have the nighthawks. Their scientific name, their genus name translates roughly to evening dancers, a really beautiful name. In the Florida Keys, really limited range is the Antillean nighthawk. In the Southwest is the lesser nighthawk, and then there's the common nighthawk, the widespread bird who I was talking to you about a few minutes ago. There's one bird in this genus, is the common poorwill with their moth-like plumage. We have the 3 other wills, the 3 main wills, the so-called cavern mouths. I'll talk to you about that later. The Eastern, the Mexican whippoorwills. These are closely related species that until about 20 years ago were considered one species. And the Chuck-Will's widow, which is kind of the epicenter of kind of the south, the southeast, I should say, and kind of the southern Midwest, but does range a little farther north. And we have the parakeet, whose name translates to night racer. Here in Colorado, the common nighthawk breeds, so too does the common poorwill breed. The vast majority of nightjar encounters are going to be with one of these 2 species. The lesser nighthawks has been documented as being a probable nester in Colorado in just a couple spots, but it's seen a little bit more frequently during migration. And then there are some historical observations and records of Eastern and Mexican whippoorwills in the state. So these are the 5 nightjars who have been documented in Colorado. That'll take me to the whippoorwill, to Eastern whippoorwills. I want to tell you their story in 5 words. As I said, I'm not a biologist or ornithologist, so I'm going to tell you their story through the thing that I am drawn to the most, which is language and the meaning of the words surrounding the bird. The first word is vermiculate. Vermiculate. This is a word I had never heard until I encountered writing about the nightjar family. And I should say most of these words are going to also apply to other nightjar species. It's a rare word, rarer than an encounter, or rarer than a nightjar sighting is this word, I think. The Oxford English Dictionary tells me that you'd have to read about 40 million words before you encounter it once. But it is in this really remarkable reference text, kind of the all about birds and birds of the world before the internet existed, called Nightjars and Their Allies by D.T. Holyoake. It is his favorite word to describe nightjar plumage, including whippoorwill plumage. This word has a couple meanings, all of which are resonant, all of which are apt for describing whippoorwill plumage. And I'll walk you through those meanings and I'll show you that feathering. So it means marked with irregular lines. This is the most literal meaning of the word, and it'll be very descriptive of what you'll see of the feathering soon. But it also means worm-eaten, worm-eaten. Another apt word for a bird like the whippoorwill, whose breeding habitat is the forest floor, the leaf litter, the rotting logs, the insects who produce that kind of decay, the worms that produce that kind of decay of the world that whippoorwills live in. It also means tortuous, which just means windy, but actually shares a Latin root with something that Bill told you I've already written a book about, which is torture. So the word's Latin root means to twist or to wrench. It's also where the word torture comes from. I point this out because one of the stories I tell in my book is about the name whippoorwill. We're used to just calling it whippoorwill. We think of it as a single name, but it's actually three words put together. That's easy to see. But those three words form a sentence: whip, poor, will. And for about 60 to 80 years, the fact that the bird's name contained this reference to punishment, contained this reference to whipping, was really part of the cultural story of this bird. You can find poems referencing it. You can find stories referencing it, especially kids' stories. And that's one of the stories of my book. But here are those feathers. These are, of course, taken out of context. Superficially, they kind of can remind you of owl feathers. They're dark browns, at least in these primary wing feathers, with some warmer orangish browns. They look barred almost. But as you get closer, you can see some of that irregular lines through those blotches, creating this really blotchy, orangish marking on the feathers. The effect is more dramatic when you're looking at an individual whippoorwill. And I should say that most photographs that you'll see of an eastern whippoorwill are going to be when that camouflage wasn't fully working in the way that camouflage can work. But even with an image like this really beautiful photo of an eastern whippoorwill, you can see elements of how the feathering produces some camouflaging effects. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that in a moment, but I just want to highlight here these little bits of almost greenish colors, which look very much like what I think is lichen next to the bird. These really beautiful black lines, black markings, actually looked at quickly produced like almost like a gash, like a rotten spot through what this bird is. It's really difficult to describe the overall effect of whippoorwill and nightjar feathering. It's designed to allow the birds to hide in the habitats that they call home. Holyoake, whose book I showed you earlier, uses the word obliteration to describe the effect of whippoorwill plumage and nightjar plumage. It obliterates the outline of the bird, a rather dramatic, but I don't think inappropriate word for this. When you look at pictures of whippoorwills in habitat, you can find images where it can be very difficult for the eye to settle on the bird. You can kind of make out a head, but then it looks like a clump, it looks like wood, it looks like stone. The tail kind of disappears. It's really difficult to find a description of whippoorwill plumage that would actually allow you to picture the bird in your head if you didn't already know what it looked like. And as an example of that, the Birds of the World account. Birds of the World is this online reference database, kind of definitive, produced by Cornell Lab of Ornithology with the support of others. It has about a 300-word description of adult whippoorwill plumage, just 300 words. In that short description, it uses the three letters ish, 16 times to describe the colors of the bird. They are brownish, they are blackish, they are whitish, they are grayish. They are almost never the actual color that word is. It uses a heap of adjectives to try to describe the markings of the bird. So they are described as speckled, freckled, flecked, irregular, indistinct, streaked, spotted, scalloped, and barred. It's like we can't make up our mind how a whippoorwill looks. This is all about camouflage. Well, I shouldn't say all about. This is largely about camouflage, about disappearing into the landscape that the whippoorwills exist in. Whippoorwills nest on the ground. They don't build a nest. Their eggs lay right on the forest floor, vulnerable to predators. And though whippoorwills themselves are well camouflaged, just about the only thing about a whippoorwill that looks like a classic bird element are their eggs. They just look like eggs. You might not be able to describe a whippoorwill in a way to call up an image of it, but if you told me they had speckled white eggs, I could get close to drawing or imagining these eggs without seeing them. I've read that the color fades over time, but still they kind of pop out off that forest floor. They're adorable young, photographed here by Mike Akrish, who was kind enough to share this photo with me. Look kind of like chicken young. They kind of look like classic little chicks. They also, at least at first, kind of stand out on those dark forest floors. So adult whippoorwills hide the eggs by sitting on them, laying on them. They can hide the young by doing something similar. And this brings me to the second word I use to describe whippoorwills, which is subterfuge. Subterfuge. This is a word that I've not encountered in the ornithological writing on whippoorwills, but I think it's appropriate. It means deception, to conceal, escape, or evade. Nightjars are kind of experts in deception. You've already seen that with the camouflage. They want to look like the landscape they're in. That's why that pourwill I showed you at Denver Botanic Gardens was practically gone until I highlighted the image. But if camouflage isn't enough, they have all other kinds of strategies to look the part, to evade, to escape the detection or the threat of an intruder. Nightjars are relatively defenseless birds at the level of their physical body. They have relatively small bills. Most of them have relatively short legs. Whippoorwills on the ground are described as waddling, not quite running. So to defend themselves, they'll look bigger. They'll look more threatening. They'll look, in some cases, injured to try to address a threat that an intruder poses. So really lovely picture by Felina English from some graduate work she was doing in Canada of the bird doing a distraction display, a whippoorwill displaying to try to distract a potential intruder. Felina also shared this amazing video with me. This is of a white-tailed deer approaching an eastern whippoorwill. White-tailed deers are kind of a two-pronged threat from the perspective of whippoorwills. On one hand, and this is not what the bird would be defending against, the fact of their possible overabundance, overgrazing means that they're changing the structure of the woods that whippoorwills live in and breed in. They're removing essentially the cover that whippoorwills use. But white-tailed deer are also omnivorous. We tend to think of them as herbivores, but they will also eat whippoorwill eggs and whippoorwill young if they encounter these birds on a nest. And so here's an adult whippoorwill trying to distract and essentially scare off a white-tailed deer. I've been kind of stalling to see if you could potentially find the bird. If you haven't spotted, I think it's her tail underneath some shrubbery, you'll soon see her. You can also hear an eastern whippoorwill calling in the background. The chicks of nightjars have defensive displays. This is a great video taken by Kate Stone of MPG Ranch up in Montana. This is a pourwill chick that they were working with. You can see that as the feathering comes in, they look closer and closer to their habitat. But nightjar young, whippoorwill young, are also described as lunging at potential intruders to try to scare them off. Despite being tiny, despite being so small, they also make pretty terrifying noises, and they open their bills in kind of horrifying, at least from the perspective of someone who's not expecting it, their perspective. almost reptilian, almost like a dragon type noise. Here we have an adult common porwheel whose stone had placed like a radio tag on, and they're making sure that the bird could fly. You already see kind of a defensive posture. The bird's feathers are lifted. Frankly, it looks angry compared to most porwhels I've seen. But what strikes me is how this moth-like plumage of their genus name looks taut, almost scale-like a reptilian around the face, around the back of the head and the inside of the wings. And you see that mouth opening, you hear the hissing, which leads me to my third word, Antrostomus. This is the genus name of chuck-will's widow and the two whippoorwills, as well as a few other species. It means, as I've told you earlier, cavern mouth. This refers to the incredibly large gape of this family. Here's a chuck-will's widow opening its mouth and displaying in that kind of way. These mouths serve kind of this defensive display function. They also allow birds in this family to eat incredibly large prey and basically swallow them whole. So chuck-will's widows are known to swallow warblers, not often, but sometimes whole. Eastern whippoorwill mouths, their gape is 1.5 inches. This allows them to swallow insects that are up to 20% of their own length. I've done some kind of math to convert this. Based on that, to kind of give you perspective here, this means this would be a 6 foot tall person opening their mouth 9.5 inches wide, which is, if you get out a tape measure and you feel so inclined, probably about how big your face is. So it's like opening your mouth to your entire face. You'd have to be able to swallow a sandwich about 12 to 15 inches long to match the feeding prowess of a whippoorwill. And they're doing this to swallow moths, to swallow large beetles. Those are their two main prey items. Word number 4 is their species name. This refers, and it translates to clamorous. This kind of recognizes what's most famous about whippoorwills, their song. They're known to sing their song repetitively through spring and early summer. They'll sing into late summer sporadically and into the fall. And they have one of the most well-known songs of the eastern US. It gives the bird its name, whippoorwill, which is a representation of that song. And in most languages where the bird has been named, in French, in Spanish, and in many indigenous languages as well, the bird's name represents the song to the ears of people who speak that language. And here is that song. I'm going to play it for you for a moment. The song is almost always represented as 3 syllables, but if you look in our field guides, you'll often read that middle syllable of pour actually sounds like 2, is represented often as actually 2 sounds. So it's possible we can describe the song as having 4 syllables. They also are documented as giving a cluck noise before that call, which can only be heard at close range. If you're listening from a roadside like I have, you won't hear it, but if the bird is near, you might hear that noise. And so it's important to recognize that how we hear the song, how we represent the song in our field guides and the naming is not quite what that song sounds like, and certainly not what the birds themselves will hear. My 5th word, lunophile, rarer than vermiculitude. This word's not even in dictionaries, but it shows up in some of the ecological and scientific articles around whippoorwills and some other nocturnal birds. From the human perspective, it means one who adores or worships the moon. From the whippoorwill's perspective, it also means one who syncs activity to the lunar cycle. This, to me, is like the superpower of whippoorwills. They are in tune with the full moon. They sing more vigorously during a full moon. They hunt more vigorously during a full moon. And ornithologists speculate that this could be because they tend to hunt, they nest in kind of denser forest. They kind of hunt at open edges, places where the canopy opens up, in meadows, abutting forests. They usually hunt from lower perches and they hunt upwards. And we think that the full moon backlights prey so that they have a better vantage on the animals that they're hunting. There's also evidence that they will sometimes time the hatching of their eggs to the full moon. So those eggs hatch a couple days before the full moon, allowing the adult whippoorwills to hunt more vigorously and therefore feed these very needy young better amid the full moon in the days before and prior. In a recent study, and this is where I learned that word lunophile, Alicia Corpatch and her colleagues documented that whippoorwills in more northern locations, they were looking in Canada, that kind of arm that goes into central kind of Canada, more northern populations of whippoorwill will time their autumn migration differently based on when the full moon falls in September. An early September full moon, the birds will normally stay put in their kind of more northerly range, enjoying the hunting that they can get in early September. Later in September, when the threat of cold and threat of frost threatens their prey, they'll leave a few days prior to the full moon. Corpatch speculates that this is because it allows them to get to a more southerly location, a stopover location where they can kind of feed more vigorously in a warmer place where frost and cold don't threaten their food. That's kind of briefly a story about whippoorwills and their kind of life course and their natural history. That brings me to the cultural side, the side that I'm really focusing on in my book. There was a time in the US when people kept watch for the first whippoorwill. Much like birders have their first of the season or first of the year, the first whippoorwill kind of rated as big news. This is a story of phenology, which is the watching of the world, the watching of nature and the environment for signs about the season, signs about what's about to happen. It's also a story about lore and superstition. The story I'm going to tell you, the kind of data and evidence I've collected, part of it comes from newspaper articles mentioning this phrase, first whippoorwill. What you can see here is from about 1870 to 1970, the papers in the east of the US would often include reports of the year's first whippoorwill. I collected about 440 articles. 177 of those actually shared a report of the year's first whippoorwill, like we heard it last week, so-and-so heard it last week. And a lot of those included some description of what that song meant. So here's an example from 1886 out of North Carolina. You can see here last Wednesday night, April 14th, we heard the first whippoorwill of the season, which is a sign that spring has opened and that it is time to go barefooted. This was a common belief about season change and the year's first whippoorwill song. It was documented as early as the late 1700s, attributed to an unspecified Native American tribe in some writing about US nature done by the English. So it's a belief that is, at least we think, originates in Native American beliefs around whippoorwills, but it kind of took on a life of its own in Euro-American culture, in US newspapers. So the idea that it brings spring and it's time to go barefooted is a common one around the eastern whippoorwill in the year's first. I want to fast forward almost 100 years to one of the final of these reports I've seen. I quite like this newspaper, the Logan Daily News out of Logan, Ohio, though I've never been to Logan, because it was one of the last places where people were documenting the year's first whippoorwill, at least in the database I've looked at. There were a trio of journalists, Ethel Poling among them, who would share community news. You see here people coming and going in these first, third, and fourth paragraphs. And then you see between it that Mrs. Viola Wagner let Ethel Poling know that she heard the first whippoorwill Tuesday evening, April 22nd. And Poling was pretty dedicated to almost each year reporting on the year's first whippoorwill. People were waiting, people were listening, people were sharing this news because the first whippoorwill of the year was incredibly meaningful. In terms of season signs, or this phenology, this idea that we can read the landscape from the perspective of what birds were here, what birds were calling, whippoorwills were incredibly meaningful. They were part of the natural cycle. They told people that frosts had ended. So one of the most consistent and widely shared beliefs is that frosts had ended. Certain flowers like hawthorns pictured here might bloom. But the idea of frost ending was incredibly important. Some kind of counter narratives grew up. There was a belief in something called the whippoorwill storm or whippoorwill winter, which I can tell you about in the Q&A if you want. But really the dominant belief was that frost had ended. This had consequences for farming. So you can't plant certain crops until you know frost has ended. Here in Colorado, where frost practically never ends, or as soon as it ends, gets ready to come back. We know, if you're a gardener, the struggle around frost. But if you want to put out corn or if you want to put out beans, the idea was you would wait till after you heard your year's first whippoorwill. In the South, other plants were recognized as getting this treatment, cotton and tobacco being the main ones. But this was an incredibly important moment when the first whippoorwill sang. Certain other lifestyle changes would follow. I showed you one already about time to go barefoot because the whippoorwill had sang. This was also attributed in the late 1700s to a Native American tribe. It too took on a life of its own. It was eventually narrowed to children could play barefoot after we heard the year's first whippoorwill. But my favorite, really personal ritual around the year's first whippoorwill was reported by the United Press in 1941. This brief story was shared at least 27 times. That's likely an undercount because the databases don't show every newspaper. And it tells the story of a person named R.H. Griggs in Alabama who would get 2 haircuts a year, which he timed to particular nature-based events. And his spring haircut was timed to the arrival of whippoorwills back on the landscape. And again, this kind of circulated widely as a bit of Americana in 1941. Other lore and superstition grew up around the year's first whippoorwill. Bill has already told you can make a wish on the year's first whippoorwill. This often involved some elaborate ritual. The one that I've read that's the most elaborate is something like you roll over 3 times, you reach one of your hands over your head, you pick up an item from the ground, you put it under your pillow, and then whatever you dream about will come true. There was a little bit of folk medicine around the year's first whippoorwill, which held that if you did 3 somersaults or 3 rolls, you wouldn't have back pain all year round. So if you go out soon and listen for a common poorwill, you can try this. To me, this seems like a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are confident enough to roll 3 times or somersault 3 times at night on a still kind of cold ground, you probably weren't going to experience back pain that year. Bill mentioned that this bird was associated with wealth. You had to do things, though, to kind of unlock that potential from whippoorwills. You were said to need to shake your purse or shake your wallet, or if you had money in your purse or you had money in your wallet, you would have wealth all year round. And then finally, and probably the best known of this lore and superstition, there was a belief that the number of times that whippoorwills repeated their names was really meaningful. You would count those repetitions, and it could tell you how long you would live, or if you were single, how long till you were married. What's interesting to me is that most of these beliefs, this kind of lore and superstition, not the seasonal signs, but this kind of lore and superstitions, derives from the European bird called the common cuckoo. If you've never heard this bird, it indeed sounds like a cuckoo clock because a cuckoo clock is based on them. Not closely related to nightjars, not existing in the same kind of ecological niches as nightjars, but I'd argue existing in a very similar cultural niche. Common cuckoos arrive in spring. They start giving that repetitive call that can be easily heard, that they're named after, in fact, just like a whippoorwill does. And so many of these beliefs could easily be adapted from one bird to a very different bird across the Atlantic Ocean. So that's some of the seasonal lore, some of the seasonal superstition. This isn't all the story of Eastern whippoorwill lore and superstition. There's a lot more about the bird, but this is what I've found around that first whippoorwill of the year, the most meaningful, in a sense, whippoorwill of the year. I want to fast forward again from the first whippoorwill to the so-called last whippoorwill. I love this cover slide. This is an episode of The Smurfs from 1986. I don't remember watching it as a child. Perhaps I did, perhaps I didn't. It's a story of ecological degradation, poaching, the collection of a whippoorwill egg, and then the asymmetries in nature when an incredibly important species declines. So Smurf Village is overrun by insects after the first whippoorwill's egg, excuse me, the last whippoorwill's egg is taken from their village. They go on a mission to rescue that egg, bring it back. The adult whippoorwill, who looks kind of like a dove-like whippoorwill bird, returns, eats all the insects. Their gardens are saved. It's a nice story of redemption. But it's also a story that aptly captures kind of the status of Eastern whippoorwills over the last 70, 80, 90 years. Or excuse me, 50, 60, 70 years. Ornithologists estimate that since about the 1970s, Eastern whippoorwills have lost about 70% of their populations. Breeding bird surveys are not designed with these nightjars and nocturnal birds in mind, but the story is kind of overwhelming. Not one only of loss here on this map, imaged in red. There are some places of blue where the species might be gaining population, but kind of an ocean of red around smaller islands of blue. In fact, this decline may have started earlier. So some of the first ornithological essays I found referencing the disappearance of Eastern whippoorwills from local landscapes date to the 1920s and 1930s. They blame farming practices and they blame timber practices for the disappearance of whippoorwills from very specific places in Iowa and then the Eastern US. Some of the earliest kind of public writing that I found on this comes from Lucy Templeton, who for the better part, this is one of my favorite parts of this story, for the better part of the first half of the 20th century, wrote a country calendar for the Knoxville News Sentinel, one of the first women to work at the News Sentinel and perhaps at papers across the US. Her series, A Country Calendar, told us a lot about local nature. She seemed to have a special place in her heart for whippoorwills. She would spread the lore of whippoorwills, the beliefs around them, and she would almost always spread those initial reports of the bird. In 1954, she reported that others have heard whippoorwills, but I haven't, none on the Ridge, which was the community in Tennessee that she lived in. So she was beginning to report on the decline of whippoorwills in Tennessee. If you leap forward to the 2020s, the 2000s, you see that a lot of people have had this experience of disappearing whippoorwills or loss of whippoorwills. So on the American Bird Conservancy's YouTube video, which is just an audio recording of a whippoorwill song, you have a lot of comments about loss of the bird, sadness over that loss, nostalgia over that loss. In fact, most of the most popular comments, the most upvoted comments are on these themes: loss, grief, nostalgia for the song of whippoorwills. Because I'm interested in culture, I want to tell you that this has also been kind of reflected in contemporary country music. So just two examples, Alan Jackson's title song, I Still Like Baloney, Darryl Worley's song, Back Where I Belong, both associate whippoorwills with kind of a country life that's ever more difficult to find among urbanization, suburbanization. This is what Templeton thought she was seeing. From that initial report she made, she followed up to talk about this remarkable bird family, the whippoorwill family, the nightjar family. And what she documented was that others in her area had also failed to hear the bird that year, had also not heard the bird that year. And she tells a story about the consequences of this loss. So she talks about how she goes into her office, presumably at the Knoxville News Sentinel, and someone who works there says that he has a bird, and I'm quoting her writing here, a bird that had the most peculiar call that had driven everyone who lived near him crazy the night before by repeating this monotonous song over and over. Templeton writes, from this description, I knew it was a whippoorwill and was surprised he did not know it too. Apparently, none of the people in this group had ever heard one before, which makes me think these birds are not so abundant as they were at one time. So the decline of whippoorwills meant fewer people were familiar with them, fewer people recognized them. I think this was both about species decline and also about cultural change as we enter the 1940s, a time of suburbanization after World War II. In the 1950s, the same, changing educational practices, moving away from field and nature-based learning. It would not have been unusual at one point or another as a child to encounter stories in which whippoorwills were featured as characters, to encounter whippoorwills in lessons around spelling. And here I've chosen this one because you also see that association with that history of violence in this example on the right. So the whippoorwill name, the whippoorwill bird, would not have been so unfamiliar for the better part of the 20th century until maybe the 1940s, 1950s. Something similar is happening today, I would argue. As I say, just speaking for myself, I didn't know a whippoorwill existed until I became a birder in Colorado, left the region, came to a place where whippoorwills aren't, and met the poorwill, who I initially wrongly identified as a whippoorwill, and then learned of this wonderful family. Others are documenting this. So in a really lovely essay published last year by Holly Haworth called Once Upon a High Lonesome, she tells about how she was working in North Carolina, observing a conservation biologist doing surveys there named Chris Kelly. Haworth asked around in the community if people had heard whippoorwills calling. You can see here, she writes, "No one knew what I was talking about." And she continues on, "What if, even where whippoorwills still sing, we are no longer listening?" This is one of the questions kind of animating my book. Just to point out a couple different things about this decline of the species and also this decline of familiarity with them. You see here in the 1940s a kind of stark drop in reporting on the first whippoorwill. People sharing these reports. The bird might have been declining on the landscape. This was also a time of intense suburbanization, which was eating up habitat that all kinds of birds used. The landscape was homogenized through lawns and landscaping plants. DDT is first really used as a pesticide widely in the 1940s. I haven't seen articles confirming that this might have an effect on whippoorwills, but perhaps indeed it did. And so all of these changes go into this kind of decline of interest in reporting and watching and listening for the first whippoorwill. There are other declines we can document and other erasures of the bird we can document. So I want to tell you just briefly how this happened in horror writing and fiction. I don't know how many birders are also interested in horror fiction and writing. Until really working on this project, I wasn't, but there's this really famous short story called The Dunwich Horror, written by H.P. Lovecraft in 1929. It's about 10,000 words long. It mentions whippoorwills almost 24 times. They do all these things that whippoorwills don't normally do. They form great flocks. They endure in central Massachusetts into late October. They chant in unison, timing their chants to the breath of characters as they die. They're meant to reflect the horror that has entered the town of Dunwich and kind of reflect it back through the bird themselves. When this was made into a movie in the 1970s, a bird was used, but it was a more familiar bird, the great horned owl, who was put on the patio of the house where this unnatural horror was forming. Stephen King kept whippoorwills alive, and he actually still is keeping whippoorwills alive in his writing. But most famously in his novel Salem's Lot in 1975, some of the most affecting and also terrifying scenes feature whippoorwills calling from the woods around those scenes. This is, as always, set in Maine. When it's made into a movie in 1979, whippoorwills are erased, but birds are kept. There's like this calling bird sound, kind of sounds like a crow, kind of sounds like a gull. It's really hard to know what they were going for. When it's made into a TV series in 2004, there are no birds used as a plot line. I'm really excited because we're told that this year we'll get the long-awaited release on HBO Max of a new version, a new filmed version of Salem's Lot. I don't know when it's coming out. If I guessed, it would probably be around Halloween or sometime in the autumn. You can look for that to see if they return the bird back to the storyline. There's kind of a renewed interest in being authentic to the original material. And I'm hopeful that whippoorwills are back in that story. But what this is really is a story about cultural change and a story of ecological change, species change, and the changing place of the bird in the landscape. So that's the stories. Those are the stories I want to share with you today before I get to your questions. Before I close, just a couple little things. I want a really large acknowledgement slide, because one of the most rewarding things about this work is I get to talk to people. I get to work on my writing with people. I get to learn about nightjars from biologists and ornithologists who study them. I get to learn from members of the Colorado birding community. So I want to thank everyone who in one way or another has helped me with the research, helped me with my writing, helped me put this talk on today. I also want to share with you, I keep a website where I blog about this. I sometimes blog about birding, lonesomewhippoorwill.com, really easy to remember. You can take a look there. You can take a photo of the QR code. If you have something you want to share with me about your relationship to nightjars or the stories that you have around these birds, I would love to hear it. You can email me at my email address. But what I'm most excited about with this, so keep an eye on my blog if you're interested, is sometime this month, I should have an essay out with the National Audubon website, audubon.org. I've been working with an editor there for most of 2024, and I'm told that article will go up very soon. So I look forward to sharing that with you all. And I never like to close just on kind of a story of decline. If you're interested in learning more about the nightjar families, getting involved by participating in surveys or supporting the research of biologists and conservationists who work with this bird, here's a couple of ways that you can do so. You can just Google Nightjar Survey Network or Global Nightjar Network. I just want to thank that latter network, the Global Nightjar Network, because so many people there have been so generous with their time. They've exchanged emails with me. The videos and photos you saw today, many of them came from people in that network. So I'm really grateful for that. And yeah, so that's it. I want to open for questions from you all. Yeah, I'd love to hear your questions about the natural history of the species, about the culture surrounding it. Anything you'd like to know, I'll do my best at answering. I'm going to stop my share so we're more closely, we have a bigger screen here. But thanks so much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jared. Very fascinating how about its natural history and also how important it has been in our culture. We've got some questions. One is whippoorwill storm story.
Yeah,
Somebody
yeah.
would like a storm story.
Yeah, so the whippoorwill storm, and as someone who now lives in Colorado, and for many of you who do, maybe this will resonate as well. There was this belief that yes, whippoorwills ended frost, but as you can imagine, a bird doesn't always end frost. The timing is not always perfect. Here in Colorado, we're used to it. Our poor wills will start singing, and then 3 days later, they might be blanketed in snow, the way that our weather works. So whippoorwill could come back, and then you could have this last lashing out of this cold, rainy, snowy, approaching frost kind of weather. And that's what the whippoorwill storm was. So for all the times that whippoorwills failed to predict the end of frost, we had this other story, the whippoorwill storm. And there's a really odd article, kind of a tongue-in-cheek article about the fact that one of these storms killed off everyone's corn and beans. And so, again, it's tongue-in-cheek, it's meant to be satirical. And so the article reports that they went out and killed the person who told them frosts were done. In Tennessee, there's also the whippoorwill winter. Tennessee has a number of what they call little winters. I'm not really familiar with Tennessee weather, but the whippoorwill winter was allegedly one of them. Now, Templeton hated the whippoorwill winter because she didn't think it was a real thing. But again, it was this idea that you were going to get a little bit of winter after you heard the year's first whippoorwill. So that's what the whippoorwill storm and whippoorwill winter were.
Okay. One of our viewers wanted you to let her know the title of that book and the author that you held up right at the beginning of your talk.
Yeah, it's a massive reference text called Nightjars and Their Allies by D.T. Holyoke. You know, it's a little bit, I mean, because it's a book, it can't be updated like a website can. So it's a little bit, I don't want to say dated because much of it holds true, but it's 2001. So it doesn't reflect all the newest in that family's natural history and the science around it.
Okay. And then another person asked how much of this story, I think the one maybe she's referring to your talk, nostalgia, loss, change in habitat, change in humans' relationships to nature, is specific to the whippoorwill.
I think
could we use other bird species too, or other animal or plant
For
species?
sure. I think other changes on the landscape, the losses of plants, the losses of favorite places as they are so-called developed, also mirrors some of this. So a lot of this is not not necessarily specific to whippoorwills in terms of those experiences of nature. And there's a lot out there on things like eco grief, nostalgia, and other related feelings around, say, climate change, environmental degradation, and the like. What is maybe, I think, most interesting to me about the whippoorwill is that um, it can strike people quite viscerally because of how iconic that song is and how much, if they grew up with it, a lot of people now, and if you talk to ornithologists out east, they sometimes say this too, the people who knew whippoorwills most, like most deeply, knew them in childhood. So it brings them back. And that experience of loss, through the loss of the sound, maybe hearing the sound again, brings them really back both to a time and a place. And then you get people giving voice to it in country music, especially to a lesser extent poetry, and then quite a bit in nature writing. There's a lot out there in newspapers, local papers. What happened to whippoorwills? Where have they gone? Where are they going? Odes to the so-called declining whippoorwill, disappearing whippoorwill, all of those things around this really iconic species.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Your full moon reference.
Mm-hmm.
Does this include also common poor wills and nighthawks, common nighthawks?
So I'd want to double check this. My sense is that common poor wills also sing more vigorously amid a full moon. I actually was speaking with the person, or emailing with the person who shared me those great videos, Kate Stone, and uh, they do seem more active, but she also said that they're harder to catch because the mist nets might be more visible. That's what kind of her speculation was. I don't know about nighthawks. That's a really great question because they come out a little bit before, they're most active before we really get into that lit night. They're kind of dawn and dusk crepuscular birds. And so I've never given any thought to that. I don't know if it changes their behavior. I will say though, this is just anecdotal, so we can't use this as science or natural history. But in the piece I wrote for Audubon, I opened from an excerpt from Thoreau's journal, and he goes out on a nearly full moon night around Concord, Massachusetts, after days of rain. And he says he's seeing and hearing nighthawks alongside the whippoorwills later at night, later than he usually hears them. I don't know if that's the weather, the change from rain to a really nice early summer night, or if it's also the moon helping that along. They will feed at stadium lights later in the evening, I've read. So maybe the moon does change their activity, but I don't know if it's as strong as those other species.
Okay. And then here's a comment. It's interesting how the whippoorwill is associated with sweet childhood memories for people. And the coming of spring also seems to be associated with horror, fear of the unknown.
Yes. Yeah. And this is what draws me to the bird, because the meanings are so complex. It's certainly not singular. Meanings as a sociologist are always quite complex, but they're so varied here. The tentative subtitle of my book, the subtitle of this talk, calling the whippoorwill the most iconic bird, is meant kind of as like a provocation, because there are better known, more familiar birds, bald eagles, of course, crows, ravens, great horned owls. I think all could make a case for that. Even chickadees and robins, those familiar backyard birds. For me, the Eastern whippoorwill meanings are so varied. The bird was anxiously awaited and then feared afterward by some people who had these beliefs. And I've got these stories of people seeming to, they are stories, whether they're true or not, I don't know, deeply fearing this bird. There's omens around it. There's all kinds of beliefs around it. And then they're evoked in horror fiction. And they have been since at least the legend of Sleepy Hollow, the story of the headless horseman and Ichabod Crane, which happened just across the Hudson River from where I grew up. That invokes a whippoorwill as part of the haunting of the evening. So yeah, they have so many meanings. They're so rich.
In your experience, do the uninitiated confuse goat suckers with owls? Think that they're owls?
That's a great question. And then superficially, they kind of resemble them. They're kind of active at the same time. What's really interesting is that for a long time, and I'm talking into like the 20th century, at least popularly, there was a lot of overlap in identification of species. So The eastern whippoorwill range overlaps with the chuck-will's widow range. Their calls or could be mixed up for each other. The two birds were sometimes treated as a single species. A lot of the early drawings, including one of the first that Audubon made of a eastern whippoorwill, combined the common nighthawk with the whippoorwill, because you have a bird active at dawn that you see, and then you have a bird active at night that you hear but don't see. And so you have these images of birds that combine features of both. And you see this in newspapers, people kind of mixing up the two species, and that kind of persists. So I see that more so than the owl mix up is the fact that it's hard sometimes to distinguish these two. And when they're just roosting, they can be really difficult to tell apart unless you really know what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Here's a comment from somebody says she's had fond memories of hearing the whippoorwill when camping in Kentucky, but it's not always popular when it's perched above someone's tent all night long.
And those were some of the stories being kept awake, like that story that Lucy Templeton shares. You see other reports of people calling the police to be like, what can I do about this bird that's keeping me awake? And there's a great short story. Well, I don't know if I would call it great, actually, but there's a well-known great short story in the New Yorker where that is the plot line. It's kind of a crime psychological thriller of a character descending into madness because whippoorwills that only he can hear keep him awake at night. And I'm blanking on the title. It might just be called The Whippoorwill. But if you have a New Yorker subscription, you'll be able to find it on their website.
Well, I used to go down in southern Ohio along the Ohio River, Shawnee State Forest, right across from Kentucky, and looking for reptiles, road cruising at night in summer. So I have very fond memories of whippoorwills down in that. So I haven't been down there in a long time. I just wonder how prevalent they are now with the decline in species. But it's neat how we have memories of these things that bring back fond memories of the outdoors.
Yeah.
Jared, thank you very much for a most interesting talk.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, DFO.
We'll look forward to your book.
Thank you.
You want to mention again your website in case people want to keep track of when the book comes out?
Yep, it's just lonesomewhippoorwill.com. You can always email me at my name at du.edu. I'm in the DFO membership directory, so you can look me up. I think I am, at least. So you can look me up. You can just find me online through my faculty website or that website if you just Google my name.